He is a teaching assistant professor and the director of the Plant Disease Clinic at the Department of Plant Pathology at the U. Like I said, he did do this presentation about 5.5 years ago, a presentation similar to this about 5.5 years ago. And over 440 of you were not anywhere near that, being able to see this presentation. It was done in person. And at that time, I think, the capacity of the place was about 75 people. So there's a whole bunch of us have not seen this. And it is a fascinating subject because, most of us probably joined the Mycological Society thinking, with the one question in mind: can I eat it? I see all kinds of mushrooms out there. Are they dangerous? What ones are good? All that kind of stuff. But the truth be told, at the University of Minnesota, the primary mycology related degrees are all related to plant pathology and other areas of fungi, other than just the mushrooms that we see and love and pick and that kind of stuff. So this presentation will fill in a lot of wonderful information or remind you of things that you probably knew intuitively, but never really thought about. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Professor Brett Arenz.
Well, thank you, John, for that great introduction. It's always an honor to be asked to talk to the MMS, very prestigious organization, and I had a lot of fun last time I did it. So it was, I was very happy to be asked again to talk a little bit about the history of microbes. The title of my talk today is Plague, Famine, and Beer: The Historic Influence of Microbes on Human Civilization, which is a particular interest of mine. And I'll just tell you a little bit more about my own appointment at the University of Minnesota. So I'm associate teaching professor at this point, and it's kind of a unique position, but really what it is, it's about 50% teaching and a 50% director of the Plant Disease Clinic, which I'll talk about in a second here. But teaching, I teach a variety of classes, some which feature for undergraduates, some for graduates, oftentimes with a mix of students. Plague, Famine, Beer is one of the classes I teach. It's really sort of one of these large online undergraduate courses, which I'll talk about more in a second here. I also teach about the principles of plant pathology, which is kind of a foundational plant pathology course for new graduate students at the University of Minnesota. Insects, Microbes, and Plants has to do with the ecology and evolutionary dynamics of pest management. Field plant pathology, where we can go out and visit plant production systems, whether it's a farm, a greenhouse, or maybe even like an indoor mushroom growing facility, and we can talk to the producers there about their issues with production and diseases they have to deal with and different things like that. We also do Introduction to Fungal Biology, which is really sort of a diversity class more than anything else, and really tries to capture the breadth of both the true fungal organisms as well as the fungal-like organisms. And then Science Fiction and Biology is a class I've had the fortune to teach as the university honors class, which was kind of a fun one. It got into basically looking at science fiction film and literature and trying to really dissect how they actually presented science and particularly biology. And then we assess whether or not it's accurate and the liberties they took, and also get into sort of real earth sort of biology. So kind of a fun way to introduce students to biology perhaps they don't normally think that they might be interested in. So obviously the talk today is really going to be about that first class, and I'll mention a little bit more about it. But the other part of my appointment is as director of the Plant Disease Clinic, which, if you don't know, is a lab on the University of Minnesota. It's really a service lab where anyone that has an issue with a plant, has some plant that's unhealthy, can actually bring them in or mail them in, and we actually diagnose them And really the fees that we charge keep the lab going. And we get about 2,000 samples per year, representing a really wide range of types of plants. Obviously in Minnesota, corn and soybean are very important for the agriculture. But then of course, anything you can imagine in people's gardens, we do a lot of obviously things like spruce and pine and elm and oaks. In particular, testing for oak wilt is one of our most common types of samples. And so that really keeps, well, it looks like I get to admit people to the waiting room. Okay, well, someone else is managing that. Okay. So that keeps us busy, obviously, in the summer during the Minnesota growing season, and it's just kind of winding down now this time of year, which works out for me because this is really where my teaching kind of takes over until about May. So it's an interesting mix of things, and I find that they're very complementary to one another. I'm happy to talk more about either one of these at the end of the talk here. Also, I should mention that my microphone's been doing kind of weird things in the last year or so of these COVID Zoom talks. So if you find I start sounding like a robot, just let me know and I'll change the source of my microphone. It usually clears it up pretty fast. Okay, so let's get into the plague, famine, beer subject that I promised a little bit here. So this is a class that is really divided into three different sections. Obviously, the three main components of the class: plague, famine, and beer. And the plague component, which unfortunately, the last couple of years, we've been maybe a little bit too immersed in that subject, maybe more than we necessarily want to. But in any case, really what we get into is how human diseases, how that dynamic has affected human societies throughout history, whether that was when we were mainly as hunter-gatherers and transitioning into the Neolithic Revolution and the rise of cities, how all that kind of changed the different types of diseases we've had to deal with. In particular, the kinds of diseases that we believe have really shaped human evolution, we've had to deal with for a long, long time, such as malaria, where we see, really dramatic evidence in our own genome about the long length of time we've dealt with malaria. Of course, the Black Death, things like biological warfare, disease-mediated invasions, the types of diseases that Europeans brought to North America when they were, colonizing and things like that. And also getting into the history of vaccinations and, how that was, a really invaluable component in eradicating smallpox and how that's obviously been in the news lately. So it's been a topic that I think is really important for students to understand the history of. The second part of the class, famine, really talks about history of disease on plants. Oftentimes plants that we depend on for food. So things like wheat and wheat stem rust, the Irish potato famine, ergotism, chestnut blight, fungal anthropology, a very interesting lecture that Bob Blanchette will give. And I see actually he's on the call today, so perhaps he's even given this talk to you folks. If he hasn't, I would really recommend you ask him to do it because it's a very fascinating one. So, and then the beer, the third component of the class, this really, it's not just about beer. Really what it is, it's about, the first two components, the three parts are really about negative influences for the most part on humans. And the third part really looks at, actually there's some positive effects of humans and ways we've actually learned to harness microbes for our own benefit, whether that's, beer or wine or fermented foods, antibiotics, that kind of thing. So obviously this is microbes, so it's not just fungi. We're talking also about bacteria and viruses and protists and things like that. But where do fungi become important in these topics? Well, all throughout the famine part of the class, and then also, of course, this sort of quote unquote positive aspect of the microbial influence of humans as well. We find fungi really, coming back many times as important contributors. So what I've kind of chosen for you folks today, because obviously I can't present a semester worth of content, I've really kind of chosen three different aspects which I want to talk about. First of all, the history of plant pathology, how that developed as a discipline, and then the subject of ergotism, and then finally a little bit about the history of beer. Okay, so I'm going to try to give just a really kind of short synopsis of each of those things.
I had this
Right.
line, but oh, there you go.
Okay, so let's start with history of plant pathology. So when did humans really start to understand the dynamics of plant disease? Well, this is a very interesting topic, and let's start here about 371 or 300 BC, perhaps. This is Theophrastus, who was, of course, a very important Greek philosopher, student of Aristotle. He would sort of take over the school after Aristotle. He's known as the father of botany due to a couple of very important works that he wrote about, what people thought about plants and how they perceived them to, what rules they believe they had and that kind of thing. So he did write actually about what we perceive to be plant disease. And at the time, this was really, in a lot of ways seen as an improvement of what sort of had preceded Theophrastus, because in a lot of cases that was really, I guess what we would, classify as the supernatural when it came to sort of trying to understand how some of these systems work. So his approach really did rely on observation and logical speculation or rationalization. Still not so much direct experimentation, which wouldn't really get going for another couple of thousand years. But he did make some interesting observations when we look into this text. One of these valuable written primary sources that he produced. First of all, he did make the observation that cereals, some of these cereal grains like wheat and barley, seem to suffer more from rust more than legumes. And also that farms in lowlands suffered more diseases than highlands. So this makes sense to us from a modern perspective, because lowlands you might associate with a greater amount of humidity rather than the areas in higher elevation, which might be drier. And of course, we know humidity is associated with plant disease. But also that wild trees suffered less disease than cultivated ones, which also makes sense from our own sort of modern theories on disease dynamics, that wild trees, when you're in a more diverse system, you're going to have less sort of disease pressure, at least from single pathogens, than you find when you have large scale monoculture. So it's important to point out at this point, they really did not have a good understanding of what actually microbes were. They wouldn't even really understand that microbes even existed until a couple thousand years later. And so when they were trying to understand disease dynamics on plants, it really was sort of adaptations of both humorism, which is how they framed the dynamics of human disease, which some of you may have you've heard of that term before. Really, the idea is that there are four humors in the body, blood, phlegm, black bile. And essentially, if you have a disease, it's because you have too much or too little of one of these four humors. And that led to things like bloodletting and various venesection and things like that, using leeches to try to balance out the humors, which, largely we reject as medical treatments today. But the time really did fit into their sort of larger logical framework of what they perceive diseases to be. Or also miasmatic theory, which really looked at disease as sort of an element of air, sort of impure air. So Greco-Roman control of disease, as far as what did they actually do to manage disease when they had unhealthy plants? Well, of course, they prayed to gods for protection. In fact, there was a Roman god, Robigus, who was the god of rust, that they would actually make sacrifices to in April, which is around about the time when rust started to first occur, when they first observed it in the wheat crop in Italy. There was various types of folk magic where they would use different types of things. These are basically just excerpts from various sources where they were having, If you had, for example, mildew on your wheat, you were supposed to put laurel in your field, and there was some sort of element of the laurel that would draw the mildew away. Or if you had millet diseases, you could bury a toad in the field. There was also, various fungal remedies, specific fungal remedies, sometimes involving seed treatments, where dousing the seed in wine, house leek, ashes, even stale urine perhaps could be used. All right. So a lot of things that we today would look at and say, well, I don't really see how that would help much. In some cases, they might be using something that would have maybe slightly antiseptic properties, like wine, for example, that you might say, well, perhaps I could see how that could affect things. Fumigating with burning straw, crabs, fish dung, animal horns, even burning sulfur, for example, in orchards and vineyards. These were all practices that were recommended. And really, in this case, the second one here, this was really an element of that miasmatic theory that they prescribed to, where they really believed that diseases were due to bad air. Look at disease like malaria. Its name directly means bad air, because that's what they perceived to be the cause of the disease, because they really didn't have any basis for understanding what microbes were or how they could, certainly affect the human body. So they would do all these things, and their risk rationale was, well, they have a certain kind of smell, and so perhaps that's going to be effective at actually combating the air, which they perceived to be causing some of these diseases. So fast forward a little bit, out of the Greco-Roman sort of classical period of history into the medieval period. There really wasn't a lot of change. One of the sort of characteristics of the so-called medieval period of Dark Ages was that they really held some of these classical writings at very high esteem and studied them very intently and tried to sort of delve the knowledge from there. So one particular source, which is enlightening, comes from the Buch de Nature from 1388. Written by Conrad of Megenberg, who was a very important contributor of primary sources during this time. He was one of these clergymen who, of course, they were the ones who could read and write. And he wrote quite a bit about what people thought about things during the time. He has a description in the Buch de Nature, which reads, "The vapor that creates the mildew is very fine and burned by the sun, which at the same time makes it rise into the air. If this vapor suddenly changes into droplets, it falls upon the crop and will burn the fruitful substance in the same way as hot ashes." So this is really, very much corresponding to that sort of miasmatic view they had on disease, that there was some sort of atmospheric effect that would lead to disease, lead to plants that were unhealthy. Okay, so, all through this history that I presented, again, human beings really did not understand what microbes were, even that they existed. That wouldn't really occur until Anton van Leeuwenhoek in the 17th century, of course, with his microscopes, his specific kind of microscope that could actually discern microbes like bacteria was actually developed. And he would, of course, report his findings to the Royal Society in London, that humans would even know that microbes existed, okay? Which was obviously a very important step. However, it still was not agreed upon that these microbes could actually cause disease even when they were actually discovered. All right, so one plant disease we associate with this development of the discipline of plant pathology was, of course, the Irish potato famine, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. Probably one of the most historically significant epidemics we've had in human history, at least one of the most well documented, occurring from about 1845 to 1852. And of course, we could speak at great lengths about the Irish potato famine and how it developed and just different socioeconomic dynamics of why it was such a problem. But really what I'm concentrating on is how it led to our idea of causation of disease. So obviously very important disease, 8 million people in Ireland before the famine, about 1 million people died, 1 million people would emigrate away in the sort of 10 years following. So the population dropped to about 6 million. It still has not recovered to pre-famine levels. In any case, obviously caused a lot of concern. The famine was also affecting Europe to a somewhat lesser extent. As far as individuals we associate with really contributing to our understanding, one individual healed, Miles Berkeley, who was an English reverend, actually. He was also a fairly avid amateur mycologist and would be associated with describing many species of fungi. But he would actually make the argument that the fungus, this fungus that they found on these diseased potatoes, we of course know now as Phytophthora infestans, he would make the argument that this was the cause of the disease. However, during this time, there was other voices, such as John Lindley, who was actually a professional horticulturalist in England, who instead, had a counter argument that no, it wasn't a microbe. It was actually the fact that these plants were just taking up too much water, right? And so the sort of wet, cool, wet conditions that we saw in Ireland during this time, they believed was the direct cause of the famine. Of course, now we know that's associated with conditions that are good for the disease, but not the direct cause. But really, and they went back and forth in the Gardener's Chronicle during this time, which is, of course, how we have such a good record of, what some of the arguments were for or against this theory. One of the big problems which prevented advancements during this time, it prevented more people from believing Miles Berkeley, was that the theory of spontaneous generation still persisted was still accepted in scientific circles. And the theory of spontaneous generation was this belief that life could spontaneously sort of arrive from non-life, okay? And so, for example, in human disease, when they found somebody that had an infection and they had a wound that was developing pus, well, perhaps they would look at that pus under the microscope and they would see bacteria. And of course, we now know today that, yes, that's probably the cause of that infection. At the time, they had almost exactly the opposite view, and they thought the bacteria was actually the product of the infection. It was actually the product of the disease, and it was just a side effect of the actual disease, right? Largely this is due to, even though they understood that microbes existed, they really had no understanding of how their life cycles and biology actually worked. Okay, so this also affected our understanding of plant pathogens. So it really wouldn't be until this individual, Anton de Berry, who is now known sort of as the father of plant pathology, a German physician and botanist. He would perform a relatively simple experiment in the 1860s. Again, this is about 10 years actually after the Irish potato famine. He would take two groups of potatoes, put them in damp conditions, conditions that were moist enough that the folks like John Lindley would say, oh, yes, that's the cause of the disease. He would simply inoculate one group with the spores from blighted potatoes, and the other group he would not inoculate. And as you might expect, it was only the inoculated potatoes that developed late blight. So, when you look at this is really the most simple and elegant type of experiment you could possibly do. But this was really one of the important touchstones that really convinced people that, yes, microbes could actually cause disease and they weren't just the result of the disease. And this is really more or less concurrent with folks like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, who were working on germ theory of human and animals at the time. So really these kind of things developed around about the same time. And so we really look at this as the start of plant pathology as a modern discipline at this time period, because now that we have an understanding of what can actually cause plant disease, now we can actually develop efficient and effective management plans. Okay, so that was the first part of the three topics I'm going to be talking about, and this is getting into the second one. And this is Ergot and Salem witch trials. So I'm guessing a lot of you have probably heard about this potential connection because it's really, become quite, I would say, common in the sort of, cultural zeitgeist of the last 10 years, especially. It's not too, you could probably find even a special on PBS talking about this, right? And of course, it's spooky season right now. So it's definitely a good topic to talk about in October. All right, so what's going on here? So ergot, this is another fungus. This is a plant pathogen, Claviceps purpurea. It's a very interesting fungus. It essentially is an obligate, what we call an obligately biotrophic pathogen. That means it requires living plant cells to really do anything biologically. You know, it can't grow in any kind of saprophytic way on dead plant material. It needs those living cells to actually get nutrients from. And so basically it means it's totally dependent on its plant hosts. It tends to infect grasses and sedges, and you could actually find it fairly easily if you look around on various wild grasses, and you might see these sort of large black structures, whereas normally you would expect to see normal kind of looking grain. So what's happened here is the fungus has basically replaced the developing grain with fungal material, which we, of course, we call sclerotia. And as it turns out, rye is especially susceptible to this pathogen. Okay, so it's a big problem in rye. So these sclerotia are hard survival structures. This is the overwintering structure for the pathogen. You know, when the rye would fall to the ground, the sclerotia would get on the ground. They could survive over the winter and regerminate the next spring, next summer, when the new rye plant is growing and infect that developing grain head again, right? So this isn't really that harmful to the rye plant. It doesn't really reduce yields in any sort of meaningful way. Why it's an important disease is because these sclerotia oftentimes contain toxic alkaloids, mycotoxins, if you will, that can affect whatever would actually consume these rye plants, okay? So another important point about ergot is that it's one of the very few plant pathogens that we have a fairly good record from the fossil record. And that's because a lot of these microbial pathogens just simply don't fossilize very well. You know, if you think of even things like mushrooms, they don't tend to fossilize very well. But because these sclerotia are sort of hard survival structures, they can actually fossilize. And one good example of that actually comes from this really interesting discovery, which was actually made, I believe, in the 1950s in Denmark, when some folks were looking at some of these peat bogs, and they actually found this body, this corpse. And it was so well preserved, they actually assumed it was a recent murder victim and contacted the police. Upon further investigation of some of the garments that this body was wearing and some of the other artifacts associated, they actually figured out, no, it wasn't anybody recent. It was actually someone from the 4th century. So it was the properties of this bog, the very acidic nature of the bog and the low oxygen, which led to this really extraordinary preservation of this corpse. And the ergot connection here is when they actually examined the intestinal, the stomach of this person, which we just call Tulund man now, they actually found sclerotia from ergot in his stomach, so that he probably had consumed some of it with his last meal. And just as kind of an incident, he was actually found with a rope around his neck, and he died probably through strangulation. So whether he was executed or he died as sort of a human sacrifice, we're not quite sure. But you know, it really does tie into the sort of overall themes of today's seminar here. Okay, so a little bit more about the life cycle of ergot. As I mentioned before, you know, the sclerotia that develop on the rye head as it grows, these get overwintered on the ground. They will actually germinate in the spring. They will form these, you know, looking at it under a high amount of magnification, tiny, look just like little tiny mushrooms actually. And their sexual spores will be dispersed from some of these things, spread by the wind, and infect some of these new rye plants when they're flowering. And, you know, et cetera, it continues the cycle. Some important components here, which will become important, especially in the next few slides, are that the disease is actually favored by cold winters. And the reason for that is because the sclerotia survive fairly well over the winter, but they can be subject to a certain amount of microbial antagonism, which means basically other microbes in the soil can break them down. However, if the winter is very cold, there's not a lot of microbial activity occurring during that time. And so the sclerotia actually can survive at a better frequency. And then in the next year, cool, moist, kind of late springs are pretty good for ergot germination and infection. So a couple environmental characteristics that we associate with a good amount of ergot. So looking at the host side of things, rye, of course, this is Cicale cereale. This is agricultural rye, not to be confused with perennial ryegrass, which of course is more of pasture grass. Rye today, it's not something we really consider, for the most part, to be that important to our regular diets. Maybe if you're having, some pumpernickel bread, or maybe like a Reuben or something like that, you might have some rye bread. But this was probably very different in the medieval period, where it was actually very widely used. And it was especially widely used by the lower classes of medieval Europe. And the reason for that is it was probably more affordable than wheat. Okay, so it was easier to grow than wheat in that you didn't have to have as many nutrients in the soil, and also it would survive colder conditions than the wheat. But as far as a source of bread, it was seen as less desirable. It didn't rise as easily. It had different kind of taste characteristics. But again, as I said, it was more affordable, so it was widely consumed by the lower classes. How common was ergot at this time? Well, we know it was fairly common because we can actually find its fossilized remnants in some of these granaries from archaeological digs from this time. And we even see it being sort of depicted in botanical drawings from this period. From, for example, Theatri Botanica, written in 1658, you actually see a drawing of Cicale cereale, and you can actually see rye be depicted alongside it as if it was just a normal part of the plant, right? Because that's probably what they just assumed it was. Okay, so what happens when you consume ergot that's infected with rye? Well, in some cases, it can be pretty bad, and it can lead to a condition which we call ergotism today, okay? So this is a really interesting disease because there's actually a bit of diversity in ergot, and depending on what strain is actually consumed can lead to very different symptoms. So some symptoms might not be so bad. In other cases, it can cause really debilitating effects and even death. So one aspect of ergotism is it can lead to vasoconstriction, which is basically where your blood vessels get very narrow. And so when this happens in your hands and your fingers and your feet, it can basically restrict the blood flow to those areas, which can cause the death of those areas. And so you get gangrenous symptoms. And this can affect humans that consume it. You can see it happening here. It can also infect cattle and livestock that are grazing on ergot-infected pasture grass. Other types of alkaloids associated with ergot can cause convulsive symptoms and can result in spasms, mania, psychoses, itching, burning sensations. It can also cause lowered fertility. It can cause miscarriages. It can even pass on to children and infants in the breast milk of the mother if the mother consumed ergot-infected rye. So it can cause really dramatic effects in some cases, but in some cases it can cause less dramatic effects and more kind of insidious and kind of lower grade effects that you might not notice and certainly might not link to actual consumption of rye, an ergot of rye. So one disease of the medieval period, especially that we associate with consumption, is called St. Anthony's fire. First described in 857 by one of these primary sources. A great plague of swollen blisters consumed the people by a loathsome rot so that their limbs were loosened and fell off before death. Okay. So burning sensations and gangrene were the two symptoms that were most associated with the St. Anthony's fire. It was not uncommon for, if you look back at some of the artwork from this period of time, and this is even going up to the 16th century, the beggars. This is a depiction of some poor unfortunates living on the street. And as you can see, what they're missing is their feet, okay? And it's actually a relatively common component of how some of the lower class, in some cases, were depicted during that time. So Peter Bruegel was actually apparently trying to make some sort of greater satirical point about some of these individuals. You can see there's a crown, someone that's wearing the hat of a pope, and one dressed as a soldier. So there's something going on, other than what he was we're talking about with this picture. But what I'm trying to sort of point out here is that this was a relatively common element of how, in some cases, really, really people in high poverty were sort of portrayed. St. Anthony's Fire, it was called that because there was an order of St. Anthony, which was a Catholic group, an order of monks that was associated with actually treating this disease. Okay, that was considered one of their specialities. And they would actually bring people who are suffering from St. Anthony's Fire under their protection, bring them to their monastery, and they would try to get them to recover. One of the things they did was actually change their diet, okay, simply because they were at their monastery. And as you might expect, a lot of people recovered when they went to these areas. Okay, so those are, examples of some of the more dramatic effects of ergotism. I'm going to be talking about now about maybe perhaps some of the more insidious effects. And really what I'm going to be drawing upon in this component is a book written by Mary Matosian, who was a history professor at the University of Maryland, who wrote a book in the 1990s called Poisons of the Past. And she really looked at the potential effects of mycotoxins on humans and through human history. And she really concentrated on the potential effects of ergot, okay? So she would actually make this link that it was associated with higher death rates, higher disease rates, decreased fertility, and also this increase in witchcraft trials, okay? So I'm going to be sort of showing some of the evidence that she collected and, is sort of making her argument with. I would like to make the caveat now that, because of the nature of what she's investigating, it's really difficult to know with a lot of certainty if some of these things actually were happening, because of course, a lot of the evidence was more sort of correlation in nature. And of course, at the time, really, there was a very poor understanding amongst humans of what the actual effects of ergotism was, and even how to identify ergot-infected rye, okay? But she does make a number of interesting points, which I think at least bear, they're at least worthy of consideration when we're trying to understand, like, perhaps the sort of overall impact of mycotoxins on humans. All right. So first of all, she's looking at a time frame when between 1750 and 1850 in Europe specifically, when the human population of Europe really underwent a pretty large increase, a population explosion, if you will. So one of the reasons for this probably was an increase in the use of potato, right? And of course, 1850 is right around, as we just talked about, with the Irish potato famine, right? Which sort of had the opposite effect, maybe because of the over-reliance in potato. But why potato was so adopted, especially by the lower class, is because it could provide just an enormous amount of calories when grown on a single acre. Okay, many more calories than you could with any other type of crop. Okay, and of course, potato not being native to Europe was something brought back by some of these European explorers. Took a while to become popular. There's a lot of suspicion about it, but eventually it would become widely adopted, especially amongst the lower class. The Industrial Revolution was obviously occurring during this time, which led to an overall increase in quality of life. People probably getting married at a younger age, having more children, larger population. And she would also make the argument, or at least she would posit that perhaps the decreased use of rye may have also been responsible for some of these population increases. And she is, in this graph at least, drawing on some data from England, where in this particular region, you can see that rye, at least in the 1600s, was about 20% of the grains and would drop dramatically by 1900, really would largely be replaced by wheat in this area. Okay, so looking at England specifically, in a lot of the ways, when she was doing her research, which she actually did, is she traveled to all these European capitals and town centers and dug into the the city records and the historical accounts of some of these time periods to really try to understand what was happening with the populations during that time. So this is actually data she got from London from 1750 to 1909. And basically what it was looking at percent of death from quote unquote convulsions. And convulsions in this term basically were these diseases of the nervous system that specifically or more typically infected infants, right? And she actually is making the connection that these convulsions perhaps could have been largely due to infants that were consuming breast milk from mothers that had a large amount of ergot in their diets. So she would sort of make the connection that perhaps the decrease in mortality from convulsions and also some of the other infectious disease in London could have been due to this decreased use in rye. She also speculated that France used rye longer, which might have been responsible for some of their population increases occurring later. And then also that Russia tended to use rye as an important part of their diet the longest. Okay. So she has a lot of data on Russian demographics and mortality rates and what's happening there. I'm just picking out one of the examples she uses. And what she's looking at here is actually January temperatures, okay, from 0 to 10 degrees Celsius, so basically the average January temperature. And so basically collected from a number of different years, from 1861 to 1913. And then infant mortality rates, average infant mortality rates per 1,000. So as you can see, there is a quite noticeable trend for, as the temperatures were colder in January, for the infant mortality rates to be higher, okay? And essentially the connection she makes and speculates on is that with a colder winter, you're gonna have a higher rate of sclerotial survival, because of that, as I mentioned before, the reduced amount of microbial antagonism, which may, in the following year, lead to a greater amount of inoculum of ergot in the fields. You might look at the data and say, well, of course, more people are dying in a cold winter because, cold can kill people. As it turns out, most of the infant mortality was actually occurring in the summer, okay? And there's a number of reasons for that. Various diarrheal diseases, for example, which were going around, which they didn't really also have a very good understanding of. But specifically, this connection with the winter that was preceding it is definitely an interesting one. All right, looking at some more data from 1885 to 1926. A couple of different things to point out here. We have crude death rate per 1,000 dropping from 31 to 19. And then also, interestingly, we saw a drop in rye as the percentage of total starches from about 40% down to about 20%. So again, not exactly what you would classify as conclusive proof by any means, but an interesting correlation nonetheless in her overall sort of view of the potential effects of this disease. So mortality rates dropped as use of rye declined. Okay, so that was sort of a glimpse at, some speculation about the overall effects of mycotoxins on human reproduction and specifically, infant mortality in different areas of Europe. Looking at maybe a little bit more of the sort of dramatic components of ergotism, and certainly the ones that have captured the popular imagination of the public in the last decade, I would say. And this is the connection potentially to witchcraft, right? So what's going on here with this potential connection? Well, let's sort of frame this up a little bit here. So first of all, witchcraft trials. So specifically what we're talking about here is the persecution of people believed to be witches, right? I'm not talking about people trying to practice witchcraft or thinking they're witches or anything like that. I'm talking about the persecution of people that people have been accused of being witches. Most of that in Europe would actually occur from about 1480 to 1750. Believe it or not, before about 1480, this practice was actually discouraged. right? It was specifically discouraged by the Pope and the Catholic Church, and saying, people probably aren't delving in witchcraft, even though it would not be a good thing. So, they really try to tamp down any sort of active pursuit of and persecution of witches, quote unquote. But around this time, this would change, actually, in about 1480. And one of the key pieces of primary source we have from here is 1486, Malleus Maleficarum. It's just called the Hammer of the Witches, which was written by one of these clergymen who's a really zealous advocate of pursuit of witches, okay? A belief that people were actually employing supernatural practices, and had all kinds of description of demonology that people would do, and various things that you could use to try to prove somebody was a witch, things to look for, various ways of eliciting confessions and things like that. And this would, of course, lead to, well, it was one of the factors and one of the components what we associate with, the Inquisition, this really sort of troublesome period of human history, which a lot with paranoia and a lot of fairly bad things happening to people. So just a little bit of a background on what these oftentimes looked like. Oftentimes it was, when you look at this as a whole, at all these cases together, about 80% of the time it was oftentimes women that were accused of being witches, but they were not, not the only one. Often, sometimes it was men. Why it was women more so? Well, of course, there's a lot of, gender bias in some biblical writings, and oftentimes women being of lower sort of socio economic status could be used perhaps more effectively as scapegoats for whatever sort of calamity was affecting the society at the time. If there was some disease that was happening or some sort of other effect, maybe the crop failed or some bad storm hit the town and the population got restless, and they said, well, we need somebody to blame. Who's it going to be, right? So there were professional witch hunters that would come into place. They would have various trials designed to elicit confessions. You see a depiction of one of those here, which is basically this chair where the witch would sit, or the accused witch, and they would dunk them in the river over and over again until they confessed. Various methods of torture, which we of course now know is not a very reliable way of gathering intelligence or information, but is a fairly reliable way of getting people to confess to various things, which probably had some sort of positive feedback loop on their use and things like that. The punishment for witchcraft, of course, was often death. Of course, now we think of like burning people at the stake, and that's oftentimes how it's portrayed in Hollywood. It does seem as though oftentimes these individuals were executed before they were actually burned, and the burning was just a way of disposing of the body. In any case, we believe between 40 and 100,000 people were executed during this time span in Europe. And, this has been speculated in a number of different sources by a number of different historians that perhaps there was a connection between ergot and witchcraft. And in some cases, this is because, in some of these accounts of these particular incidents in these communities, the symptoms of the bewitched, these are individuals who think something is occurring to them where they are being cursed by something, were oftentimes highly reminiscent of ergotism, the central nervous system disorders, hallucinations, various things. So could these in fact have been various mass hysterias, initiated by food poisonings? Perhaps there was a bad ergot outbreak in the community and a bunch of bread got baked with a lot of rye sclerotia, and that caused people to have hallucinations. Some more data that Matosian gathered, specifically from when some of these witchcraft trials would actually occur. You can see in the areas that we now identify as France and Germany and Italy, the majority of the trials would actually occur in some of these mountainous valley regions that had a very high growth of rye. And a similar sort of phenomenon we see in Scotland specifically, whereas we didn't see too much occurring in the Western Highlands as far as witchcraft trials, but there was a lot occurring in the East. And also we saw a lot more rye being produced, consumed in that area. Okay, so ergotism and the Black Death. Obviously the Black Death, we're talking about a specific historical epidemic occurring in the the 1300s, which basically is perceived to have perhaps have wiped out about half of the population of Europe. And this is really interesting because we don't actually see mortality rates of bubonic plague being quite this high today. Of course, bubonic plague is a disease that's fairly rare because we know how to treat it with antibiotics, but it does actually sometimes occur. And the mortality rate is still very significant, maybe 20% or so. But the types of mortality rates were really very significant they saw during the Black Death. One of the speculations was their immune systems were lower because of some of this ergot consumption. And so it could have been something that really set up this population to suffer disproportionately from this bacterial disease. Also, it was a disease that's more linked to the lower classes, which again, the wealthy, the upper class, tended to consume more wheat rather than rye, which might have been something that protected them to a certain extent. Okay, so that's again, just a little bit of a interesting kind of discussion of the potential effect of ergotism on human history. Mycotoxins, of course, encompass a lot more types of things than just the ergot pathogen. We have fusarium, for example, that can produce a lot of trichothecenes that we know lead to immunosuppression, intestinal problems, various issues. And of course, fusarium head blight, one of the more important diseases of wheat today. This is really the big problem with it, is that it produces these mycotoxins. Aspergillus is a fungus, especially Aspergillus flavus, that produces something called aflatoxin, which is one of the most potent natural carcinogens which has ever been discovered. And specifically, it's actually a liver carcinogen. And we believe it's probably leading to hundreds of thousands of liver cancer cases per year, particularly in areas of the world where they don't have very good abilities to store food safely. They don't have long period, maybe more tropical areas where they don't have long periods of cold. They don't have areas, infrastructure to actually dry grain properly and store it cold. And so you get more aflatoxin production in some of these things. Oftentimes, associated with things like hepatitis diseases and other things also affecting the liver. Again, probably killing, thousands and thousands of people per year. Looking at human history, when we didn't even understand these connections at all, and we largely were not storing our food in the ways that we view it as necessary to store it today, certainly was a very significant cause of mortality that we're only really understanding in the last few decades. Okay, so I know a lot of that has been a bit of a downer. So in my last few minutes here, I want to talk a little bit about beer. And really the story of beer is very much kind of a happy accident, okay? So how long have humans been producing beer? Well, we don't exactly know, because the history does, it really occurs before the first use of written language. And of course, that's one of our most important tools in understanding history is studying primary sources, written accounts of historical events. And so, but we do know one of the first evidences of writing was actually a recipe for beer, actually occurring in 3200 BC. And we have these clay Sumerian cuneiform tablets, which basically depict how to make beer, how to produce it, and the importance of actually saving enough of grain to actually produce it. So we know it was quite important for a lot of these early agricultural systems. And there's been some speculation that it might have been actually one of the primary reasons that some of these agricultural systems actually developed, so that they would have a ready source of grain so they could produce beer. This is actually a brewery in Ohio, Great Lakes Brewing, that attempted to actually replicate some of these early Sumerian varieties of beer, which if you were to try today would actually be quite unusual and maybe a little bit dissimilar to what you would actually expect, which we'll get into in a second here. So when we think of ancient brewing, it probably looked quite different than when we think of brewing today. For one thing, they did not understand the role of yeasts because they didn't even know what a yeast was, right? Of course, a yeast is a fungus that is, of course, single-celled, microbial in nature. And really, they would have had no way of knowing that yeasts were a very important part of the process. So there was no discussion of yeast or anything like that. And essentially, brewing only worked because these things were accidentally inoculated with yeasts. They did mention that they found that some of the containers, that if they repeatedly used them, they tended to work pretty well, right? And so they had their favorite containers, which of course now we totally understand how that worked. Of course, they just held a lot of yeast that kept, persisting from brew batch to brew batch. And of course, they weren't bottling any of the beer like we think of today. So that would mean that it really wasn't getting any carbonation of any significance. And also probably didn't last that long compared to what we think of today. So looking at some of these ancient depictions of brewing, you see a lot of images of people drinking beer together, oftentimes in these large, clay containers. They would actually have these long reeds that were basically functioning as straws that they would drink out of. And probably the reason they were doing that, one of the reasons, is because the brewing essentially was a fairly rudimentary process where they had a bunch of grains mixed up with water and they let it sit and ferment for a while. And so you'd have a lot of solid material in this beer. And so using a straw was one way of avoiding actually getting that in your mouth, right? We see it depicted in writings, for example, in the Feast of King Ashurbanipal II, who was a particularly important king of Assyria in 800 BC. They basically write that he had 10,000 jars of beer that was a component of the feast. And, it's basically an example of a catering list that was being preserved because it was in recognition of the enormous importance of this king and how much they actually celebrated him, that they could actually produce this much beer. So it was an important component of festivals. However, we also believe that even it had more of a just sort of rudimentary importance, and it was probably very much a daily drink. And it was even used as a form of currency and wages. For example, the workers that worked on the Egyptian pyramids, we have records that indicate they were paid as much as 8 pints of beer per day as actually part of their ration, right? So why was this probably important for early humans? Well, they probably didn't make this connection totally at the time. They certainly didn't understand, microbial diseases and why sometimes the water wasn't safe and things like that. But because of the brewing process, especially when they started to incorporate boiling into the brewing process, it made the beer safer than water, right? And also, it was certainly more nutritious than water in providing calories and even sometimes even vitamins that some of these early societies wouldn't get in any other way. When you also look at the development of the society, or I should say more complicated societies, because of course the transition from hunter or gatherer, where essentially most people had the same job, right, to look for food or to, help prepare it in some way. When the Neolithic transition occurred and humans developed agriculture and they settled down and they stopped moving around so much and they developed towns and more permanent settlements, the societies became more complicated, where basically people took on more individualized roles in the society. And this was actually one of the first specialized types of occupations, the role of the brewer. Certainly, it was much more decentralized type of role than we see it today. You would have had to have a lot more brewers than we have. Although what's interesting is that's changed a bit, especially in North America, where 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have that many breweries. Of course, they were very large breweries. And now we have, I think like 10,000 of them were recently reported in the United States. So it's a little bit of a return to how things were, but still not on the same scale of where you would have had, a much more high percentage of brewers in those societies. Okay, so a little bit about the actual biology of what's happening here with brewing. Of course, we know this fairly well, and that it's a yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that's responsible also known as brewers and bakers yeast, because it's the same yeast we associate with using for bread and making it rise. Of course, single-celled Ascomycete fungus reproducing by budding, what you can see that in the picture here. And yeast is an interesting organism in an ecological sense, in that it's, it's not a good wood decomposer. It's not typically a pathogen, although there's some kind of odd human pathogens in some cases. But what they are really good at is actually utilizing free sugar molecules. Okay, so basically, if there's a free sugar molecule on the surface of something, like for example, the surface of a fruit or the nectar of a flower, they can utilize it really quickly and then reproduce. So that's kind of their niche in an ecological sense. But of course, what as humans we use them for is fermenting glucose into ethanol and CO2. Both of these things are essentially waste products of the metabolic cycle of the yeast. These are things that the yeast does not want to produce, right? It doesn't use them for anything, but it does because it's part of their, it's a byproduct of how they utilize the glucose. Okay, so another kind of interesting component of the history of beer, if we fast forward a bit, we get into a new type of beer, which is known, of course, as lager beer. And I guess you could, today, that's largely differentiated from ale. When you have, if you look at beer, oftentimes people say, well, it's either ale or it's lager, right? Lagering is sort of a terminology which refers to storage and cold storage of beer, because as some of you may know, perhaps if you've dabbled in the sort of home brewing, lagering requires very different conditions than brewing an ale. For one thing, it requires lower temperatures, which you would find in some of these caves, for example, if you were brewing, particularly in the summer or something like that. And it would require longer time, so maybe months for fermentation versus weeks. So we don't know exactly when lager beer was developed. We believe perhaps maybe like the 1400s, perhaps in Central Europe, like what we identify currently with Germany. The Reinheitsgebot was a law, what we now know as the German purity law. Maybe if you consume a Beck's or something like that, some sort of German beer, you'll see it part of the marketing on the side of the bottle that they're very proud of. Basically, it's a, usually what we think of it now is, well, you can put beer, you put water, barley, and hops in beer, and that's what it is, right? And yeast, of course. At the time, of course, they didn't say anything but yeast because they didn't know what that was. So they just said, barley, hops, and water, right? And that was really because at this time, there was other things that were used instead of hops as sort of a replacement, kind of a flavoring, preservative component. A lot of different things could be used in beer before hops became really popular. But in any case, the Reinheitsgebot was an interesting primary source, which tells us that they might have been talking about lagers because they refer to brewing in particular times of the year. And maybe it was because the lagers would be better to be produced over the winter, for example, when it was colder. We now know, even though, of course, they didn't know at the time, that it actually requires a different yeast to produce lager. Saccharomyces pastorianus is actually the species of yeast. And it actually ferments on the bottom at cooler temperatures from like 39 to 48 Fahrenheit, for example. Lager has overtaken ales in global popularity. Largely, this is due to cleaner tasting. When you think of things like Budweiser and Miller and all these domestic beers, these are lagers, right? This is a little bit of a misleading kind of statement because, in the last 10, 20 years, of course, we've had this explosion in craft brewing, which has really led to a lot of resurgence of some of these ales, right? Which of course are not lagers. So but still, if you look at the overall market value around the world, lagers still kind of dominate from an economic point of view. Okay. So again, two different types of yeasts. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the ale yeasts, warmer temperatures, top fermenting, found in the nectaries and flowers, et cetera, et cetera. Saccharomyces pastorianus, that's our lager yeast. It's bottom fermenting, usually cooler temperatures. So one question, though, which has really confounded scientists is where did the lager yeasts come from? Because we know it wasn't specifically added by people because they didn't know that yeasts were really important. When we look at it today, we find that it's actually a species hybrid So it's a cross between Cerevisiae and something else. But where this something else actually came from was a very interesting and mysterious question. So even only in sort of recent, the last decade, have we kind of begun to understand this a little bit more. And still, maybe at the end of this, you say, well, that's not very convincing. But let me just hear me out here. In 2011, they found a similar yeast, Saccharomyces eubayanus, which is similar to this sort of mystery lager ancestor. It was actually discovered in this tip of South America, in Patagonia, on beech trees. And specifically in the galls of beech trees were infected with this other fungus called Cyteria. It's totally, unrelated Ascomycete fungus in this case. All right. So if that was the origin of lager yeast, how did it move to Europe in the 1500s when we believe sort of about lagering was really kind of getting going? Well, there was speculation that perhaps some of these early European explorers might have potentially moved it. For example, like Pedro Cabral, who we know was one of the first to actually visit Brazil in 1500 and would eventually return to Europe after visiting, going all the way to to India. Ferdinand Magellan, of course, we associate his voyages with actually the first sort of trans navigation of the world. Of course, he would visit Brazil when he crossed down the southern tip of South America, and eventually his ships at least would return to Europe. So can potentially it have traveled? Maybe these Europeans, visited some of these forests, gathered some supplies, and eventually brought it back to Europe, and it ended up in the sort of vats of some of these German brewers. It seems pretty far-fetched, right? But that was sort of the speculation of perhaps that might have been what happened. However, since that time, a few years later, they actually found even more closely related yeast species from Tibet, okay? And it actually had an even more closer similarity to what we now associate with the lager yeast. And so the idea here potentially is that trade along the so-called Silk Road, which had been occurring for at least 2,000 years, might have actually brought this lager yeast over to Europe, where it was somehow, found its way into a brewing vat. Again, you think of the odds of that happening, they seems rather low, but until they find, this ancestor yeast sort of growing, in Europe, I don't know that they're going to have sort of a better idea of how this potentially happened. Okay, so that was the end of my last of the three kind of components I wanted to touch upon. Happy to take any questions, talk about either some history stuff or some plant pathology stuff, some disease clinic stuff, whatever you want. So thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Brett. Let's see. I was monitoring the chat, and there was a couple of questions that were on that. One of them was basically just pretty much a comment saying, if memory serves me, ergot was used medically as well to treat migraines. Was that correct?
Yes, that's a really good point. It was associated with being effective for migraines for quite some time, actually. And it was actually also used as a medication for women who had just given birth to prevent excess bleeding. And it was likely probably because of the vasoconstriction that was happening, to kind of restrict blood flow. And also, I neglected to mention, I don't know why I didn't put this in here, but of course, it was eventually the source of LSD in the 1940s, and the whole sort of Albert Hofmann story, which of course makes the hallucination effect make a lot more sense, I think.
And there was one other comment or a question that's just asking, can ergot occur in any grain? Does it still happen in crops now? Because there's a kykeon or something that's used that uses fermented barley.
It can affect a few different types of grasses. We do definitely see it more in rye because it's more susceptible. I will say it's fairly easy to control these days. In a lot of cases, it's simply because you're you're planting clean seed, right? And you're not planting a mix of seed and ergot grain, which you just harvested from your field without knowing there was a problem. So basically, there's a few other plant diseases which we've almost eliminated by just cleaning the seed, like bunts and things like that. It's one of our more success stories in plant pathology. And also, even if you do have a crop with ergot, you can do things like you can put it in a vat of water and you can actually float the ergot away to sort of skim it off the surface. But you will still sometimes read about outbreaks in areas of the world where they don't have this knowledge or they don't have the technology, or it happened. But largely, it's something we control really effectively today.
Okay, let's see. Are there any instances of fungi playing a prominent role in science fiction literature and film?
Yeah, there's a few. There was, I'm trying to remember what the name. I just read this book, actually.
I remember seeing, actually, somebody sent me a DVD of a movie called Shroom, and it was about somebody going stark raving mad, using some psilocybes in Ireland. So somebody did actually, Richard mentioned Star Trek Discovery.
Star Trek Discovery. There was a book I just read. It's called Mexican Gothic. And I don't want to spoil it too much, but there's a very strong fungal connection that's made that's kind of linking the whole plot together. If anybody's read that book. Somebody's read it.
Yep.
And there's a video game. I can't remember the name, but it's basically this, there's fungi that infect insects that cause them to kind of become zombies. And the idea is that there was one that's adapted to humans that's affected them a similar way. Last of Us, yeah, somebody got that one. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of cordyceps and, zombie insects and stuff, that sort of, if I was prone to nightmares, that might give me one. Cordyceps attacking people.
Somebody mentions, I could see this ergot brew and Eleusinian mystery cult. I have not heard of that one. I'm going to have to look it up. So thanks for the lead on that one. But yeah, I didn't hear of that one.
Let's see. And then there was another question. Is it known what role ergot plays in the fungus that produces it?
That's a really, really good question. If you look at a similar type of fungus, not a similar type of effect, the mycotoxin, like the psilocybe mycotoxin, I believe there is some thinking that perhaps it has an effect on insect behavior. If the insect would actually consume it, and that it would affect their sort of neurobiology. And maybe it's a way of actually either preventing the insect from consuming it or actually trying to get it to disseminate it in a more effective way. But you see this with plants as well, I should just say, and some of the pesticides that plants naturally produce, like nicotine and caffeine, even cocaine. These are all chemicals that certain plants produce to influence insects, either to kill them or to dissuade them or to prevent them from eating them in some way. And humans, because our neurochemistry has some similarities, but it's not totally the same. We get different effects. We get a buzz instead. And so we kind of, employ them in our recreational way. So it's not too surprising that something in nature has this sort of human effect, even though it doesn't really make sense to us in sort of an evolutionary way.
Well, that's what I have seen in the chat so far. And I mean, a lot of information about a couple of other movies. One from
Avatar was one.
Yeah.
They talk about these plants communicating with one another and things like that. And we think of like mycorrhizal networks,
Yes.
flow of nutrients and potential signals and things from plants to plants. I think there's a lot of things potentially going on there, which are going to be similar.
Right. I mean, to see the connections of some of the oak savannas and the connections between trees and how trees will fight off disease using each other and that kind of stuff. So it's kind of interesting. There's things we don't understand.
Oh yeah, lots we don't understand.
Let's see what
Well, that's what makes science fun. There's
Yes,
always
it
more
does.
questions.
Well, thank you so very much. This was once again extremely enjoyable and very informative, and we thank you very much for taking your time tonight.
Thanks for having me.